So UFC Fight Night Seattle, Adesanya versus Pyfer this weekend, and overall it should be a pretty decent card. I'm gonna get into my predictions, starting with the early prelims, ending with the main event as I usually do. I'm gonna give my breakdowns and reasoning for each fight. You gotta just follow along, and then let me know what y'all think. I'm gonna get right into it. Start off with the early prelim opener of Alexia Dainara versus Bruna Brazil for the women's strawweight bout. As far as this fight is concerned, honestly, I think Dainara is going to have a pretty easy time with this one. I've said this several times in the past. I just don't think Bruna Brazil is that good. Genuinely speaking, I just don't think she's that good. I think her history has proven that. I think now at the UFC, when she's competing against quote unquote UFC level opponents, I think that she has a lot of difficulties in most cases. Amongst the fighting nerds, I think that she's probably the least impressive. Even if you include people who joined the team after her being one of the central initial members. But I think Alexia Tainara is just better. I think that Tainara's grappling is really what's going to present the big differentiator. I think Tainara has good enough striking as well to just be more economical, more efficient with it. I think Tainara gets her out of there. I think Tainara gets a finish in the second or third round, and I think fairly easily as well. Moving on, we have a fight that I expect to be a lot more competitive than the previous one, which is Ricky Simone versus Adrian Mar. What do I say? But Ricky Simone versus Adrian Yanez at the bantamweight division. This one, I think, is gonna be different. I was saying Adrian Martins because I was thinking about different matchups because I was just looking at that. But Ricky Simone versus Adrian Yanez, I expect to be a much more competitive fight. Due to these stylistic matches between these two, I think that especially when it comes to how they fit, I think it'll be interesting. I think Simone hits harder. I think Yanez is faster. I think it's classic speed versus strength type of matchup. I think both of these fighters have pretty good, well-rounded experience against different opponents. I do think Simone initially would probably struggle a little bit more just to get the timing and the pace, but I think that he finds Yanez eventually and is able to like stick it out. Expect it to be a back and forth brawl a little bit. I'm expecting to go to a decision, and I think the decision will favor Ricky Simone. Moving on, we have Navajo Sterling versus Bruno Lopez. Now, this one is going to be pretty fun. And by pretty fun, I mean I expect it to be quick. I think Navajo Sterling gets him out of there within the first round, maybe the second. Navajo Sterling is also a member of the City Kickboxing team alongside Israel Adesanya. But I think Navajo at this level, I think Navajo at times tends to get a bit of a slow start in that he takes a lot of time to intentionally try to be cerebral and download his opponents, but there are other times where he might just go for it and figure it out along the way. And I think that at the level of Bruno Lopez, I'm kind of expecting him to just go for it to kind of get it out of the way, especially seeing as his teammate Israel Adesanya is main eventing this card. I think that he probably wants to put on a show and utilize the publicity that's going to come with this to kind of really make a statement. Navo is undefeated, and he is one of the prospects right now for light heavyweight that a lot of people have their eye on. And I think that he'll get it done pretty easily and pretty swiftly. I just don't see Bruno Lopez as really having anything for him that would make me believe that he could even last into the third, much less win the fight. Moving on, we have Casey O'Neill versus Gabriela Fernandez. This matchup, I'm expecting Gabriela Fernandez to win. I'm expecting a decision fight, to be honest. I think how both of these fighters' skill set is set up. I think they both have different avenues in how they could utilize, whether it be the grappling, the striking. I just don't think either of them are like overwhelmingly dominant into the point that I'd say they'd be able to get the other one clamped down. By that, when I say overwhelmingly dominant, I mean one might be better at striking. Like I think Casey O'Neill might be a little bit better at striking. I think Gabriela Fernandez might have a little bit better grappling. I don't think either of them have such a huge gap in between that I can directly say at this point in time this is an advantage or this is a huge advantage in their favor in this fight. I think that It is an advantage. It's better, but I don't think it's a big enough or a huge enough advantage or big enough gap that you'd say, okay, then if it stays in this avenue for too long, they'll just outclass the other person or dominate, as you would do with Oliveira's grappling in most opponents, or you would do with Topuria striking against most opponents. Like you in those cases, you'd say if it stays in this realm for too long, you're most likely to win. Whereas in this case, I'm like, I think it's going to be a bit of a back and forth. I think Gabriel Fernandez, which is why I pick her, is because I think that she'll just be a little bit more gritty. I think she'll make it a little bit more dirty if it ends up that it is leaning away from her. I think she'll be the one who kind of bite on her mouthpiece and try to do a little bit extra just to secure the win. And that's how I see it. See it decision in favor of Gabriela Fernandez. Now, this fight, we have Marcin Tybura versus Terrell Fortune. This fight should be a pretty decent one. As I've said before, and as I keep saying, they are attempting to rebuild the heavyweight division. They're trying to bring in prospects. They're trying to use said prospects to get out former or current gatekeepers in the current division so that they can slowly rebuild it from the outside in. My opinion, Terrell Fortune, somebody who they're giving him Marcin Tybura because the reality is at this stage in the game, Tybura is one of the most synonymous names when it comes to the current heavyweight. I think Terrell Fortune will get it done. I'm expecting a second or third round finish on his part. I think Tybura is just too old. I think he's too old. I think he's too slow. His boxing is decent. He has solid durability. And he has decent grit when it comes to the heavyweights. However, I just don't see him having any attributes. He has the power. It's heavyweight. All of them have the power. But he doesn't have the speed. He doesn't have the movement. He doesn't have the mobility, the overall high. He has decent fight IQ, but not to the level where I'd be like, oh, he could really just completely outthink his way out of a situation that is just completely too dominating. I think Terrell Fortune just goes in there. I think the first round looks sloppy between the two. They kind of go back and forth a little bit. By second round, Terrell Fortune finds the mark. And if it takes until the third, that as well. But I think Tabor is going to get backed up for the majority of this fight, going to be unable to properly constantly defend himself. He tends to hold his hands a little bit below the chin. So I think that he'll be in a situation where he'll have too much to think about, whether it be striking, leg kicks, anything in between. I think he'll just get overwhelmed and eventually gets taken out. So second or third round finish for Terrell Fortune is my pick for this fight. Moving on, we have one of the ones that I'm most curious about, which is Chase Hooper versus Lance Gibson Jr. This matchup, I think Lance Gibson Jr. gets it done. Chase Hooper is one of those guys that I feel as if people keep having expectations of to like see his development, and he'll get to a point. Sometimes he look great, sometimes he looks like he could be better. Overall though, he's a guy that as the fans we tend to like him, quote unquote gooning master, so and so. A lot of us tend to be fans of him, enjoy his personality. Sometimes his fights can be a little bit on the slower side. They can have lack a little bit of the entertainment factor at times. But in this matchup, I think Lance Gibson Jr. is just going to be too fast for him. I think striking wise he's going to be outmatched. I think a lot of people outmatch Chase Hooper when it comes to striking. I think he'll be clearly outmatched with Lance Gibson Jr. I think he will have an advantage in the grappling. However, I don't know if he has the physicality to like push a proper grappling offensive at the pace I'm expecting this fight could potentially get to at times. I think Lance Gibson Jr. is going to get in there initially, try to get him out there with the striking. Some gaps going to happen, a little bit of scrambling. They get into grappling exchanges, and Lance Gibson Jr. is able to escape those and or secure reverse positions and get to ground and pound. I think overall this fight could potentially just be a lot of wear and tear on Hooper within the first two rounds. And the third round is really where I could see things getting more and more ugly, just at the pace and tempo I'm expecting this fight could go. Chase Hooper has surprised us before. He has elevated himself at times against opponents that you would expect him to struggle more against. But in this matchup, I just don't see that happening. I think Lance Gibson Jr. gets a finish in the third round. However, I wouldn't be opposed to being proven wrong by Chase Hooper, just surpassing my expectations of him at this point and pulling out the win. But as for my pick, I got Lance Gibson Jr. by finishing the third round. Moving on, we have Ignacio Bahamondes versus Tafik Musayev. This fight, this one should be a pretty fun fight. Bahamondes is usually a pretty fun fighter to see. Big fan of him myself. Tafik Musayev, both of these fighters coming off loss. I know that both of them going to come with that intensity. Musayev is probably going to attempt to utilize this opportunity to really put himself in a position because, once again, despite his loss, a lot of people still have a lot of expectations of Bahamondes, and he is one of the fighters that people have eyes on, including myself. If I had to say how I think this fight's going to go, I think Bahamondes wins. I think Bahamondes has better striking. I think he also has more power. I think he has better striking, as in more technical, more accurate, faster, and stronger. However, I think that his submission game may be a little bit lacking. Grappling, I think Musayev has more offensive or better grappling in that aspect, but I don't think neither of them necessarily have crazy submission game that would seriously threaten the other person based on their competency level in grappling defense. But I think Bahamondes doesn't have the proper submission game that would help him in to overcome some Musayev, and I think same vice versa. But I think Musayev would be able to get to those positions better than Bahamondes necessarily. So I think that this could either be a big scrap between the two, where somebody gets put out early, or I think this could potentially be one of those fights where it ends up dragging because they both are at that level of good enough to nullify each other, but not great enough to overwhelm each other. So I could definitely see that being the situation that we're dealing with, and it just be resulting in a lot of back and forth and potential moments that end up getting stifled. Um, that being said, I have Bahamondes as my pick for this fight. I think Bahamondes just has everything he needs to secure the victory. I think even if it doesn't end in a finish, I think he has the aggression, I think he has the striking, I think he has the grappling defense and offense that would enable him to not just make it to the end of this fight, but to make it to the end of this fight victoriously. Because of how I see these two matching up against each other, I'm going to actually go with a decision. I think that Bahamondes ends up winning by decision in this fight. I think it'll be overall a pretty fun fight, potentially, but I think that if it ends up being a less entertaining fight just due to how well they match up against each other, that wouldn't surprise me either. Oh, moving on, we're into the main event now. We have Terrence McKinney versus Kyle Nelson. This is interesting because McKinney is silly as hell. To be blunt, Terrence McKinney is just silly as hell. He might go balls to the wall and get a finish immediately in the first 3 minutes. He might do that, get knocked out. He might get exhausted and barely make it to a decision. He might get crazy exhausted and just lose. Like, Terrence McKinney's kind of, sometimes it's a bit difficult to predict fights for him. This one, I think Colin Nelson gets it done. I think Terrence McKinney is going to come out strong, as he does often. I just don't think that he's going to be able to land intelligently enough to take out Kyle Nelson. I think Kyle Nelson makes it through that initial onslaught, first 2 minutes, let's call it, within the first round in general, but really that first 2 minutes. I think Kyle Nelson will be able to kind of start implementing and imposing his will and securing this victory. I do think that Kyle Nelson is careful enough. He could find openings initially, but you have to be careful because in trying to find openings, you also create openings yourself. So you might end up trying to take out McKinney because of how aggressive he can be in the beginning and then end up succumbing to your own flaws and through counter strikes. But my opinion, I think Kyle Nelson gets McKinney out of there. I'd say that he gets a finish in the second round. That's my pick. I just think that Terrence McKinney is going to really try to get it done, especially like he's one of those win-loss fighters, win today, lose tomorrow. Like he's one of those back-and-forth fighters. So I think that he's going to try to come back in, coming off a loss, try to come back in with a big win, try to dive at him, open himself up. Nelson just take advantage of that, like uses it to exhaust him, and then in the second round, get him out of there. So my pick is Kyle Nelson by second round finish. Let's move on to the next fight. In this one, we have a middleweight bout between Mansour Abdul Malik and Yusri Belgorou. My opinion, this could be a pretty fun fight. Um, I want to pick Abdul Malik, but I'm not. I'm. This is one of those fights, probably the fight that I'm most conflicted on, because I think Mansour Abdul Malik is a great fighter. I think he's very skilled. Technical level, I think he's one of those fighters in the middleweight that people are expecting a lot of. However, I think that he does have an issue, despite being undefeated. He does have an issue of sometimes leaving himself unnecessarily open, sometimes being a little bit timid and hesitant in how he exhorts his offense. Sometimes he really is just pulling the plug when he has opportunities. And in the UFC, that could be very dangerous and detrimental, especially against an opponent on the level of Yusri Belgorui. I'm expecting Belgorui to really try to push that pace on him as well. And I think that some of those slower moments that tends to result from Abdul Malik could really put him in dangerous situations and leave him compromised in this sort of matchup. This I think that it really, really, if could go either way. If Mansour Abdul Malik is on his A game, I think that he'll have a beautiful performance. If he is too lackadaisical at certain moments, I think that he could really compromise himself and end up getting defeated in this one. Despite saying all of that, I'm still gonna have Mansour Abdul Malik as my pick. Um, I think that this could either be a third round finish on his part or a decision. I think it really could go either way, especially him going against a bigger opponent, especially an opponent who can be a little bit more aggressive, an opponent who can be a little bit more intelligent in those key moments. I think that he really could put himself at risk. But I still think that he'll get it done. Because of the nature and the danger of this fight, I'll probably say Mansour. I'll commit to Mansour Abdul Malik winning by decision. But if he got the finish, that wouldn't surprise me either. Moving on, we have Julian Erosa versus Larian Douglas. I'm going with Larian Douglas with this one. I just think, to be blunt, I think it's a matter of youth. I think it's a matter of youth as well as current skill level. I think Larian Douglas is younger, faster, stronger. I just think that's what it is. I think it might not necessarily be a skill issue. I just think that it might be a matter of I just have the physicality to go with the skills that we do have, and I think I'm just able to impose those better. I think it's probably going to go to decision because Erosa is a solid fighter, but I think Larry and Douglas just out athleticisms Erosa in this fight and is able to like steal himself a decision in this matchup. Moving on. Speaking of youth, that is not present in this fight. We have Michael Chiesa versus Nico Price. Really surprised both of them are still here. They're both old, slow fighters. Like they're both old, slow unk fighters. This is basically battle of the cookout, as in literally just uncles fighting at the cookout. Both of these fighters are way past their prime. Neither of them are really capable of fully implementing the game plan they once did, which is why them going against each other is probably an ideal matchup for them. I think Michael Chiesa is the one who's retained more of his physicality at this point in time, and I think that he'll be the one to end up winning. I think he wins by decision, honestly. Chiesa has got solid grappling, and I think Nico Price has decent as well, but Nico Price is a little bit more susceptible to his chin is a little softer in comparison to Chisea's. Neither of them are good strikers. Like, and I don't mean great, I mean good. Neither of them are good strikers. They're both like below average at best when you watch them striking. If I'm just being transparent, it's not going to be a master class. It's not going to be a crazy performance. This is going to be very much type of what's the word? This is going to be a type of quote unquote rosy glasses fight. I mean, this is this is one of those trip down memory lane type fights. Like I remember back when these fighters were younger and they used to be more entertaining. It's going to be one of those fights. So definitely think that it'll be solid for what it is. Like it'll be a fun fight for what it is. Kind of similar to when Bobby Green fought Tony Ferguson. I think that's what this fight is. Even though Bobby Green is much more relevant to the current game than Ferguson was at that point in time, but than either of these two fighters are currently, but it's just the idea of these two fighters. This is a fight specifically meant for like the old fighters are still on contract. They're still willing to fight. Neither of them have officially retired as yet. So we're going to put them against each other because they are just simply not capable of going against current prospects whatsoever. My opinion, regardless of who wins this fight, they both should retire after this. Like they both have other sources of income outside of the UFC, and I think they should take advantage. It's time to put down the brain damage and focus on family. But either way, I think Michael Chisaya wins this fight by decision. Moving on to the co-main event, we have Alexa Grasso versus Macy Barber. It's going to be a solid fight for the women's flyweight bout. That being said, I think Macy Barber gets this one done. I do understand Alexa Grasso is a former champion. I understand that Alexa Grasso has solid grappling and submission skills. That's literally how she became champion. And she also has solid boxing fundamentals. I think Macy Barber is better than her. I think Macy Barber is more aggressive. I think she's more physical. I think she's more intentional in her offensive. I think Alexa Grasso works best when her opponents make mistakes. I think Grasso is, I think, once again, same with what happened against her versus Shevchenko. I think Grasso will be there. She's willing to go and engage, and then you slip up, and then she uses your mistakes to take advantage. But I don't think she's good enough to force those mistakes. I think literally she needs you to just make simple mistakes in order for her to have her biggest moments. I don't think she's a good enough fighter at the top level of her division to force you into those bad positions that make you make mistakes or to overwhelming you massively, like amongst the top five, excluding the champion, amongst all top five ranked fighters in the current UFC's women's flyweight division. I think all of them would beat Alexa Grasso. Honestly, I just don't think that she's good enough to necessarily dominate, overwhelm, or pull apart from any of them. I genuinely believe that there was a bit of luck involved in her initial fight against Shevchenko. I think her second fight against Shevchenko, she lost, but they still made it a draw because of various reasons. And I think in her third fight, it was just so one-sided that, yeah, they just had to accept that she lost. But against Macy Barber, very aggressive female UFC fighter, very willing to like throw, get down and dirty, willing to risk her own safety to land big blows, which could put her in danger. But the thing is, I think that that will force Grasso out of position, especially in the striking, and she wouldn't really have the time and opportunity to really take advantage of those moments as much as she'd like to, as opposed to a Shevchenko who, while Shevchenko has solid knockout power, Shevchenko's power tends to come a lot from her counters, and I think that when it comes to that, that's where Grasso was able to kind of force her into so positions that made her just not think about the grappling by getting too caught up in with striking exchanges, and that's how Grasso was able to win initially. Macy Barber just a lot more reckless abandon and a lot more willing to focus more on aggressive initial damage. So I got Macy Barber by decision. Moving on, we got the main event. As you can see, we have the number 4 ranked Israel Adesanya versus number 14 ranked Joe Pyfer. Body bags. So Joe Body Bags Pyfer is one of the quiet prospects with middleweight right now. There was a point in time where Pyfer was the hottest thing moving. Then he had his sole loss. I believe his sole loss in the UFC. Either his sole loss or his most recent loss. I don't remember which one it was in the UFC. And then after that, that was when like you saw a little bit of his momentum died. Then he went kind of heel publicly, in the eyes of a lot of fans, just by staking his own opinions and like sticking to them. and so on and so forth. These two have been very respectful with each other. You already know Israel Adesanya, legend of the game, like former middleweight champion, objectively second greatest middleweight of all time. Like has all the records kind of been in a bit of a downward spiral recently. However, still trying to attempt, still trying to be active. How do I see this fight going between the two? Honestly, I'm expecting Izzy to kind of wreck him. I'm expecting Israel Adesanya to take his time because that's been one of his biggest issues. I think that's actually been a large contributor for all of the fights he's lost recently. I think I think in the Strickland loss, he just got overwhelmed way too quickly, and he just was surprised by the level of opposition he was facing and wasn't able to properly recover. I think his matchup against Dricus Duplessis, I think he was winning that fight. I think that the pace started getting too hot, too rapid, and then he ended up getting caught up and get submitted in that. Then when you look at his fight, his most recent fight against Nasruddin Imavov, I think literally he got fouled. He tried to hop back into it. He tried to be too cool. And then the pace that came back at him, he just wasn't fully ready and just got caught, got taken out. I think Israel's biggest path to victory is to relax, calm down, go at his own pace. He says that a lot. Outside of the ring, he speaks really well. But when it comes to the actual fights, he gets wrapped up in pace way too easily in recent times. Uh, I think skill for skill wise, these two aren't even in the same planet. I think Pyfer's skill level is nowhere near the same realm as Israel Adesanya. Joe Pyfer is a very strong UFC fighter. He's a very strong MMA fighter. He doesn't really have crazy technique. His striking isn't that overwhelming. His grappling isn't that crazy. There's nothing on paper that I look at and say Joe Pyfer is better or even competitive against Izzy. And Israel Adesanya's grappling defense is significantly better than any offensive grappling that Joe Pyfer has. And Israel is still capable of pushing a wrestling strategy himself, as we saw him implement against Pereira in their first matchup. And then Israel Adesanya has the size on Joe Pyfer. So even when it comes to strength and grappling, Israel is just better. Izzy, in general, is better absolutely everywhere. He's more experienced, he's more accurate, he's faster in his prime. If anything, the most you could give Pyfer is aggression, and that one might be the only thing. He's just willing to be more aggressive, but against an opponent with the skill level of Izzy, he'll just get countered and just beat up until eventually finished. I would like Israel Adesanya to just take his time and do what he knows he does. I'm expecting this fight to go to the third round. It's a five round fight. I think Israel Adesanya gets him out of there by the third round. He's that much better than him. I think he's good enough that he could get him out of there sooner. But if he learns from his past mistakes, go at his own pace, and gradually increase his intensity, I think that it should take around 3 rounds for him to get him out of there. That's my pick. Israel Adesanya by third round finish. Y'all let me know what y'all think, though. Like, share, and subscribe. Happy to have y'all here. Hope y'all have a great week. Till next time, peace.